So it's been a busy week in Albany. Let's get into it with Joe Spector from Politico and Keisha Kluge from Bloomberg Government. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So this was the governor's second State of the State address. Joe, I'm going to go to you first. What stood out to you?
Well, what stood out was, what did the governor race last year show that the most important things were for voters? Affordability and crime. And, let's face it, it was the closest governor's race since 1994. And due to the fact that Lee Zeldin was effective in hitting on those two issues. So what did the governor talk about? Affordability and crime. And particularly on the affordability piece was interesting. There's no secret that New York leads the nation in outmigration and population loss. So, you've heard governors talk for a long time, for decades, in fact, about the need to try to stem that tide, try to bring people back to New York, try to lower taxes. We have a property tax cap. They give back money each year through various tax programs. But Hochul's trying to look at like a systematic way to make it more affordable, and that was in part through her housing plan, which she's trying to create more housing, particularly in the New York City suburbs and in upstate, to try to, if you have more housing, then theoretically it might be cheaper for people to live, and then for people from New York City, where it's increasingly hard to find housing and makes it more expensive, then there might be an ability to lower some of that.
I think the zoning part, so we've talked about it earlier in the show, but there's a part of her plan that would I don't want to say force, because we don't really know the exact details of it, but it would allow local governments to, or the state to override local zoning changes to make some of these changes for housing in the long term. Joe, do you see that being a big fight? Oh,
I see that being a big fight. I mean, when you're coming in as a state and trying to tell local municipalities, you need to build X number of houses. I think it's like 3% a year in sort of in the inner ring suburbs, and then 1% a year. It's the reason why a lot of times New York tries to dissolve villages, and it usually gets shut down. People like their local government, they like their local control. So how's the governor going to convince people on Long Island or in Westchester or Rockland or wherever that you need to build X number of houses to bring in new people? What does that do to the schools? What does that do to the infrastructure in these communities? And so there's a lot of questions there, and I think it's going to be, it was talked about during the State of the State, we wrote about it, but it's going to be a real big issue going forward.
I think so too. Keisha, what stood out to you? I know that you covered the minimum wage part of it and some other parts.
Yeah, so I think touching on Joe's issue of affordability that the governor brought up, she is planning on tying the minimum wage to inflation, which I think goes halfway to what unions and worker advocates want, especially like Senator Ramos and Assemblywoman Joyner both have a bill that would first raise the minimum wage and then attach it to inflation, so that it basically takes it out of the legislature, so you don't have to have this fight every few years, and it would just tie it to the increases that we're all seeing. So I think she got a standing ovation on that part, but there's still a lot of work to do. So I think we'll kind of see what happens, especially in the budget and then as the process unfolds. We also saw a lot of stuff on climate. She talked about electrifying buildings, banning new gas installations by 2025 for small buildings, I believe it was 2028 for larger buildings. This is the fight against the gas stove, which I think there are a lot of opinions on one way or the other. So we'll kind of see how that plays out as well. And I'd also like to note something that she didn't discuss at all, which is education, which...
Yeah, there was, it was in the book. We get a 277-page book with all the governor's proposals every year. It varies page length. And there were some sections on education, but as I was putting together our story this week for it, I did notice in the speech she didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
I wonder why.
I don't know, and especially if you're touching on affordability, she talks about herself as the first mother governor, and so it's kind of interesting that she didn't touch on that. The state in the book did say that it would fully fund schools under this foundation aid formula that has been, the bane of everyone's existence, trying to get this thing fully funded for decades now. And so I don't know, we'll kind of see from that. And I'd like to note too that, of course, this wasn't the budget, so this is just her policy proposal. So there's a lot of top line issues that she touches on that we need to wait and see what the actual bill language says.
A lot of these issues, a lot of the proposals that she's putting forward and that have been talked about at the early part of session have kind of set up this divide at the Capitol, where we have Democrats controlling both chambers of the legislature and the governor's office, but we have this faction of Democrats in the state Senate and the Assembly that are considered far left, more progressive types, pitted against the more moderates. Joe, I want to ask you just politically, does that make it more difficult for the governor this year? Democrats control everything, but it seems like it doesn't help us get to solutions faster sometimes, like when they're trying to strike a deal.
Yeah, that's right. You have everything controlled by Democrats, but that doesn't mean they're in lockstep with each other either. I mean, they come from different parts of the state. An upstate Democrat can be quite different than one from New York City. And so you see some of that. Now, last year's election, some moderates did lose, so I think it's pushed the legislature, the Democrats, more to the progressive end, so that's created a little bit of a divide. But yeah, when you talk about issues like bail, for example, right? I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but she wants to have this least restrictive standard removed, where judges would have essentially more discretion to set bail, which has been at the crux of this issue since the law was first passed in 2019. So maybe some moderate Democrats would support bail changes, but I don't think you're going to see progressives. Carl Hastie, has talked about it. You're not going to see them moving to do much on bail, but we'll see. We'll see what the budget comes out with.
I agree. I mean, the Democrats that lead the Assembly and the Senate have been very resistant to bail changes, to the point where last year it only happened because the governor kind of brought it up last minute in the budget negotiations. I'm wondering if something similar happens again this year. We have a few minutes left. We have to touch on the chief judge nomination. Hector LaSalle, as we've mentioned, is the nominee. And it's kind of like this same situation where we have progressives trying to block the nomination and moderates kind of seems like they're on the fence. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of moderates coming out with strong support for LaSalle. Keisha, where is this fight right now?
Yeah, it's really interesting though, because it's kind of gaining traction. There's several sides to it. There's Latinos for LaSalle who want to see, the first Latino chief judge on the Court of Appeals. And then you've got all these unions coming out. So you are seeing a little bit of a turn here. It's not just necessarily progressives coming out on that. So it's kind of interesting that Kathy Hochul is not standing down. She is saying, this is my candidate. I think he's very important to get through. And progressives are saying, listen, we just lost seats to redistricting, which ended up giving the Republicans majority in Congress there because of the seats lost in New York, and that was part of redistricting from a conservative court. So they're saying, we can't have a conservative court. Look what's happening at the federal level. Work with us to get a candidate that works. And so we'll see what happens with, it sounds like the Senate doesn't have enough votes to make it out of Judiciary Committee, and therefore it wouldn't go to the floor. And then there's this whole constitutional question.
I don't know.
Yeah, this has never happened. This process was set up in the 70s. There's only been 2 times where the Senate Judiciary Committee didn't agree with the judge's candidate. In both situations, they sent it without recommendation to the floor for a vote, and they were the governor had wrangled enough votes to get it on the Senate floor passed. Yeah. In this case, the committee is saying, we don't have enough votes to even do that. It's probably going to die in committee.
Wow, we got 30 seconds left. Joe, just compared to this process in the past, this seems messier than usual, right, as Keisha was saying.
Yeah, you usually see this on a federal level, right, for the U.S. Supreme Court. Now we're seeing it here in our backyard in New York. So just set the stage. Wednesday, there'll be the confirmation hearing for LaSalle. What happens out of that? And as Keisha well put it, does it get out of committee? Does it get to the floor? I mean, usually that happens on the same day. It's kind of a celebratory situation where you get the judiciary, the chief judge sits up in the Senate
gallery.
The gallery, and with her family, and it's a celebratory day. When I'm not so sure it's going to be celebratory on Wednesday.
Right. It's a really complicated situation, and it's just, as Keisha said, kind of unprecedented as we're seeing play out in history right now. Kind of a cool time to be covering New York State government. but we are out of time. Keisha Kluge from Bloomberg Government, Joe Spector from Politico. Thank you both so much for being here. And we are out of time for this week. Thank you so much for watching this week's New York Now. Have a great week and be well.